Thank you, Les Carla. And before I begin, I want to draw attention to the absence of Minister O'Gorman, who has the responsibility for the government's response to the coordination of immigration. And his absence from the debate here this afternoon, I think, sums up the government's approach and handling of this entire situation. And this debate is... Sorry, Minister? But in fairness, Minister, you are the ones that timed and set the time for this debate, and a debate that is necessitated by a crisis brought about by the government's complete mismanagement of the entire issue. The erosion of state services over many decades across the state has pushed communities right to breaking point. A situation compounded by the failure of the government to engage directly with them over new arrivals in their community, which are not equipped to deal with the added numbers within their communities. Instead, with communities, what they're getting are contradictory information, contradictory news from government, from local government, about the reality that is happening in their communities and on the ground. And with the promises of additional resources and services failing time and time again to materialise within their communities. And Minister, new figures show that some 950 refugees are sleeping rough on our streets, whilst communities across the state are at breaking point. And this is simply down to the failure of government to develop a coherent plan. And Minister, in the early days of the Russian invasion, I was one of a number of members of the Oireachtas who visited the refugee camps on the Ukraine, Romanian and Moldovan borders, where I witnessed at first hand the scale and the extent of human tragedy starting to unfold. In March 2020, the EU Commission proposed to activate the Temporary Protection Directive, and it's scheduled to come to an end on March the 4th in 2025. And it has to be said, it's completely unclear at this time what measures will be put in place by government to address the situation in respect to those unable to return to Ukraine following this date. And we know that at this point there's some 103,000 Ukrainians within the state. However, we believe that it is incumbent on the government to signal now at this stage to those Ukrainians in Ireland and to the EU that when the Temporary Protection Directive expires in March of next year, at the latest, that Ukrainians will be subject to the state's immigration laws. Ukrainians who wish to remain in Ireland past that expiration date should be allowed now to start applying for critical skills permits, for example. And also, Minister, if their home part of Ukraine still remains unsafe at that time, they should be allowed to apply for international protection within our system. But that requires additional resourcing to cope with the additional numbers that will be availing at that point. But what we need is information, what we need is clarity from government now, at this moment in time, to give clarity. And Minister, Ireland was quick to enthusiastically express its willingness to accept large numbers of refugees, which was the right thing to do. And at the time, I recall figures of up to 200,000 being talked about. And despite the fact that these figures were being freely thrown about by minister after minister, by the government, the lack of planning and foresight by the government has been absolutely shocking. Absolutely shocking. Absolutely no plan whatsoever. And we've now reached a point where in budget 2024, 26% of Minister O'Gorman's department's budget will go towards temporary and international protection spending. 20% towards Ukrainian support, and 6% towards international protection accommodation services. And it's estimated that this year there will be somewhere in the region of between 12 and 15,000 international protection applicants. And that compares to an average figure of 3,500 a year between 2017 and 2019. And I think the single biggest failure of this government on the whole issue of immigration has been its failure to hold fear in check. Fear is being allowed to travel unchecked and untrammeled across the state. And this is down to a singular failure by the government to communicate clearly with communities. And the prevalence of fear has positioned this course on the issue soundly in the field of emotionalism. It is the great tragedy of the history of human interaction that when debate is mired in an emotional miasma of fear, factual and rational discussion is rarely allowed to be heard. And this is the feverish environment that this government has actually created. Within the information vacuum left by the government, far-right agitators have been allowed to hold court. They've used the moment to foment fear. We've witnessed international applicants being assaulted on our streets. We've witnessed accommodation centres burned to the ground. We've witnessed members of this House, of the Oireachtas, accosted on the streets outside the gates of our national parliament. We've saw the streets of our city centre burned during uncontrolled riots. And Minister, the lack of prosecutions continues to embolden these criminals. And the current government's communication strategy is a shambles. There is no clear evidence that at any time that a coherent communication strategy has been in place. There has been no coherent communication strategy, and there is no evidence of a government willing to engage in good faith with communities, to listen to their concerns, to temper their fears, and to address the added strain on services which are already at breaking point right across the state. And the disparities which were allowed to exist in terms of the government offering full access to social welfare and higher rates of payment than other countries have left Ireland out of step with our EU counterparts. And there is no doubt that change is needed to bring Ireland's policy into line with other European countries. And change should come, but Minister, it must be humane. For those currently in Ireland, Ukrainians currently in Ireland, it should avoid cliff edges and it should be staged. I believe that changes to rates of social welfare payments, which must happen, must be guided by the need to provide adequacy, decency and life with dignity. Minister, we do support and the need to reduce social welfare payments for new Ukrainians arriving to the state. However, we are concerned that the government are creating a perverse incentive which will heap further pressure on the private rented sector. And you're doing this by reducing social welfare payments for newly arriving Ukrainians who live in designated accommodation centres, only while continuing to offer social welfare payments equal to those of citizens of those Ukrainians who live in the private rented sector. And Sinn Féin, we propose to amend the International Protection Act of 2015 and related social welfare legislation to fully decouple cash supports for beneficiaries of temporary protection directive from the ordinary social protection system. A review of the equity and adequacy of payments to international protection applicants must also be conducted, Minister. Minister, Sinn Féin, we remain committed to phasing out direct provision. However, given the significant escalation in the numbers coming here, the priority in the short to medium term must be the provision of larger accommodation centres to afford shelter, safety and necessary services to those fleeing war or persecution, whilst reducing to the greatest extent possibly The reliance on buildings and land that should really be used for other purposes, including hotels, nursing homes, student accommodation, and indeed critical ordinary housing. These centres should be human rights compliant and allow for a level of privacy and dignity for all occupants. And Minister, Sinn Féin, what we would prioritise is the creation of state-run accommodation centres, which would include the use of buildings like vacant office blocks, so that the basic needs of Ukrainians and asylum seekers looking for shelter it can be met safely. We would also prioritise the return of hotels and other buildings to their original purposes to the greatest extent possible, to restore local tourism-based economies and vital services for communities that really are at breaking point now in many parts of the state. And Minister, at the outset of the Russian invasion, it made sense to award medical cards automatically to those seeking safety here, deferring the means test to a later date. However, the HSE was issued policy instructions in 2023 to continue to award the medical card automatically for a full 12 months to Ukrainians who continue to arrive. And this despite the absence of operational or capacity barriers at this time to conducting an earlier means test, and despite the provision of the Irish law that entitlement should be on the same basis as Irish citizens. And Sinn Féin, Minister, what we propose is reducing the preferential treatment in the award of medical cards by conducting medical card means tests earlier for all those. Minister, I have to say I'm opposed to open borders, a position that Sinn Féin have laid clear over many years, including in our 2020 general election manifesto. What I favour and what Sinn Féin favours is a rules-based system on immigration and migration, guided and governed by humanitarian concerns, but one like those that exist in other European countries where we have control over our borders. We must have a fair, efficient and enforced migration and immigration system, a system with well-functioning rules and regulations which is fully, comprehensively and understood by all. The International Protection Act of 2015 empowers and sets the parameters in which the Minister can designate countries as safe. Conditions include that it can be shown that there is generally and consistently no persecution, torture, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, and no threat by reasonable or indiscriminate violence in situations of international or internal armed conflict. This assumption that a country of origin is generally safe for its citizens to live in facilities, faster processing of IP applications. Of course, I'll conclude now in a minute. Sinn Féin time, in fairness, last count caller. Of course, each IP application must be assessed individually, and the applicant may rebut the assumption with respect to their particular circumstances. Minister, we originally had 8. It's now proposed to increase it to 10. That's something that Sinn Féin supports. Other countries have more safe countries and different countries on their safe list. That needs to be looked at. There are also systems that have partial designation of countries as safe, and that is something that needs to be looked at also. And Sinn Féin would propose that we amend the legislation to allow that partial countries will be designated as safe. And just to conclude, Minister, there's been a serious failure of government to plan. And that's not just over the last 2 years since the illegal invasion of Ukraine. What we've seen is successive governments over many decades neglect, fail communities the length and breadth of the state. But what we've seen over the last 2 years is the chickens coming home to roost, and communities really feeling vulnerable and let down by a government that's neglected them time and time again. What we need is change. What we need is investment in communities. But Minister, I'm certainly under no illusions that this government is going to deliver on that and make the changes that communities need. I'm convinced that will only come about with a change, and a change of government that is.